There are certain moments in this business when you realize people are paying a lot more attention than you expected. Sometimes it's because of a controversial joke. Sometimes it's because you invited the wrong or the right guest. And every once in a while, it's because people simply can't believe two people from opposite ends of the political spectrum are about to sit down and have an actual conversation instead of screaming at each other. That's exactly what happened when people found out I was going to have Vice President JD Vance on the show. For days before the interview, almost every conversation started the same way. Wait, you got the Vice President? Not, how are you? Not, nice weather we're having. Just immediate disbelief. I have to admit, I was a little impressed myself. I've interviewed presidents, senators, governors, billionaires, comedians, movie stars, you name it. But there's something about having the sitting vice president across from you that still makes the occasion feel different. It reminds everyone that politics isn't just something happening on television. These are the people helping make decisions that affect millions of lives. When JD walked out, the audience greeted him warmly. There was applause, curiosity, and that unmistakable energy that fills a room when everyone knows this conversation could go anywhere. I smiled. You know, I said, I'm pretty impressed myself. He laughed. Okay, great. That broke the ice immediately. I continued, I'm very excited about this. The audience laughed because they could tell I wasn't entirely joking. Then I realized something funny. I'd actually become something of a collector. I had Pence on. JD nodded. I've had both his vice presidents. The audience erupted. Just a couple of weeks earlier, Mike Pence had been sitting in that exact chair. Now here was JD Vance. I'm killing it with the vice presidents. The applause got even louder. Sometimes comedy isn't about clever writing. Sometimes it's simply noticing something ridiculous that's true. There I was, a late-night comedian accidentally building what looked like a vice presidential loyalty program. JD couldn't help laughing. Of course, that immediately led to the obvious question. So he asked, what did you talk about with Mike Pence? I looked at him with the straightest face I could manage. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The audience exploded. Even JD laughed. Obviously, that wasn't what we talked about. Well, not exactly. The joke worked because everyone already had an image of Mike Pence in their head, and it certainly wasn't one involving Led Zeppelin and recreational chemistry. When the laughter finally settled, I told the truth. What surprised me most about interviewing Mike Pence wasn't anything political. It was how human he seemed. Television has a funny way of flattening people into caricatures. Someone becomes the conservative guy. Someone else becomes the liberal woman. Another becomes the cable news villain. After a while, people stop imagining there's an actual person underneath all the headlines. Then they sit in front of you for an hour. You start talking. You make jokes. They make jokes. Suddenly, they're no longer a walking political label. They're just a person. That's what happened with Pence. I admitted that to JD. He was a lot more human than I'd ever seen him. That wasn't a political endorsement. It was simply an observation. There's a difference. People confuse those two things all the time now. Apparently, acknowledging that someone smiled once is considered an ideological betrayal. It shouldn't be. One of my favorite moments from that earlier interview came when I invited Pence onto my podcast. Now, if you've never heard my podcast, let me summarize it. People come over. We talk. And yes, we get stoned. So I looked at Pence and invited him. To my surprise, he didn't immediately recoil in horror. Instead, he said something I never expected. Maybe, just maybe. The audience had loved that story, and they loved hearing it again because the image of Mike Pence considering a marijuana podcast is objectively hilarious. It doesn't matter what party you're in. That's funny. Comedy often lives in the gap between expectation and reality. Nobody expects that answer. JD laughed along with everyone else. It was the perfect way to ease into what I knew would eventually become a much more serious conversation. Because that's always my goal. Law first, think second. If people are smiling, they're usually listening. Once everyone relaxed, I decided it was time to bring up something I'd been hearing over and over again from viewers, friends, audience members, and people who stopped me on the street. When I mentioned JD Vance's name, one issue came up more than any other. I wanted him to hear it exactly the way I'd been hearing it. So here's what sticks in people's craw, I said. He leaned forward. Okay, the number one issue, he nodded. Immigration, he immediately answered. Okay, I held up a hand. Not immigration. He looked surprised. Because that's an important distinction that often disappears in today's political arguments. People hear one word and assume they know where you're going, but reality usually lives somewhere else. I explained what I meant. We like that you closed the border. That needed to be acknowledged. Whether people supported every policy or not, many Americans believed border security needed attention. JD answered simply, "Thank you." But that wasn't actually where my concern was. I wasn't talking about people trying to come in. I was talking about people who were already here. The people who are here, I said. Then I became more specific. The way you treated them. I made sure to clarify something important. I'm talking about your administration. I wasn't accusing JD personally of being out there conducting immigration raids himself. That's not how government works. Still, administrations own the actions carried out under their leadership. He listened carefully. I continued. ICE, all that stuff. I paused. Too rough. Another pause. Too mean. Then finally, too unnecessary. The room became noticeably quieter, not tense, just attentive. There are moments during interviews when everyone knows the conversation has shifted gears. This was one of them. I wasn't trying to score points. I wasn't trying to create a viral clip. Honestly, I was trying to offer what I considered friendly advice. I think you've got... Then I stopped myself. I'm not telling you what to do. JD laughed. Okay. I'm just giving you some advice as a friend. That got another laugh. Then I clarified one more thing because this matters to me. I'm not asking you to apologize. I've never liked the modern obsession with public apologies. People demand them constantly. Then when someone finally apologizes, everyone immediately argues about whether the apology sounded sincere enough. It's become its own endless performance. That's not what interested me. I wasn't asking for guilt. I wasn't asking for self-condemnation. I was talking about acknowledgement. I told him what I honestly believed. You'd go a long way toward getting people who've completely shut the door on you and your administration if you'd simply own that you guys went too far. Not everything, not every policy, not every decision. Just that some things crossed a line. Then I reminded him that he'd already done something similar before. You owned the childless cat ladies thing. The audience applauded loudly. It was recognition that admitting one mistake doesn't erase everything else. Sometimes it simply shows people you're capable of reflection. JD didn't look offended. He didn't become defensive. Instead, he paused for a moment. And then he smiled slightly. Well, it was clear he had been thinking about this argument before, and he was ready to answer. Part 2, JD leaned back for just a second before answering, almost as if he wanted to make sure he responded to the argument instead of the applause that had followed it. That's something I appreciate in an interview. It's easy to react to the room. It's harder to stay focused on the conversation. He looked at me and said, okay, so here's the basic problem with that bill. I knew immediately we were moving away from slogans and into the reasoning behind the administration's position. Whether people agreed with him or not, he wasn't trying to dodge the question. His point was straightforward. You cannot do any deportations without law enforcement. That was his starting point. Not politics, not polling, law enforcement. He wasn't pretending immigration enforcement happened through press releases or speeches. His argument was that once a government decides to enforce immigration laws, officers inevitably become part of the equation. And you can't do a law enforcement operation like that, he continued, without having some situations that don't look good when they're recorded. That sentence stuck with me because it addressed something that's become almost unavoidable in modern America. Everything gets recorded. Everything, a cell phone appears within seconds. A 10-second clip travels across social media before anyone knows the full story. Sometimes those clips expose genuine wrongdoing. Sometimes they don't tell the whole story. The difficult part is figuring out which is which. JD wanted to illustrate what he meant, so he temporarily set immigration aside. Let me give you one obvious example, he said. Let's just set aside the immigration element of this. Fair enough. He switched to another type of law enforcement. If you take a guy who's committed murder and you go arrest that guy, he paused just long enough for everyone to picture the situation. sometimes that person is going to resist arrest. That's hardly a controversial statement. People resist arrest, sometimes violently, sometimes irrationally, sometimes because they know exactly what's waiting for them afterward. He continued building his point. If you take a video of it and it's out of context, again, context. It's a word that almost feels endangered these days. Everything moves so quickly that context often arrives long after opinions have already hardened. And you don't appreciate why that person is being arrested in the first place, he said. It looks pretty icky. The audience chuckled slightly at his choice of words. Icky isn't exactly the term you'd expect in a discussion about arrests and immigration policy. But it made the point without turning the temperature up another notch. Then he brought the analogy back to immigration. What I worry about, he said, is when people say you can't ever do immigration enforcement if it produces a bad video clip. He paused. What they're really saying is you can't ever actually do immigration enforcement. That was the heart of his argument. He believed critics were focusing on the unavoidable visual consequences of enforcement instead of the underlying policy itself. Whether you accepted that reasoning or rejected it, that was the case he wanted to make. He wasn't claiming every encounter looked good, quite the opposite. He was saying enforcement, by its nature, sometimes produces uncomfortable images. Then he shifted from philosophy to numbers. We had 12 million people come into the country. He clarified the time frame from 2021 to 2025. That statistic formed the foundation of his larger argument. From his perspective, those numbers represented a situation voters wanted addressed. And we were elected with a mandate, he said, to get some of those people out of the United States of America. Mandate. That's another word politicians love. Usually because elections become proof that people agreed with whatever they wanted to do all along. Still, his point wasn't difficult to understand. His administration believed voters had chosen them, in part because of immigration policy. If they then refused to enforce those policies, they'd be ignoring the very reason many supporters elected them. You can't do that easily, he said. No flourish, no dramatic pause, just a simple acknowledgement. Law enforcement deporting people is never an easy process. That sentence landed differently. It wasn't celebratory, it wasn't triumphant. It sounded more like someone describing a difficult reality than someone enjoying it. Then he circled back to me. So I appreciate your argument. I nodded. He genuinely seemed to appreciate that I wasn't arguing against immigration enforcement itself. I had already said that. My concern wasn't whether immigration laws existed. The concern was how those laws were enforced. That we've gone too far, he continued. But we couldn't do nothing. There it was, the phrase that summed up his position. We couldn't do nothing. Not everything was perfect. Not every operation looked good. Simply that doing absolutely nothing wasn't an option from his perspective. And I don't think there was an easy way to do this. I listened carefully because that's what interviews are supposed to be. People sometimes imagine interviewing means waiting impatiently until it's your turn to talk. That's television at its worst. The best interviews happen when you're actually listening, because listening tells you where the conversation should go next. I agreed with one part immediately. No, I said. Of course. There wasn't much point pretending immigration enforcement would ever be clean, simple, or emotionally satisfying. Governments don't get handed easy problems. If they were easy, they wouldn't become national political battles in the first place. But agreement on one point doesn't erase disagreement on another. I looked back at him. Sometimes one word buys you enough time to organize your thoughts. There's a middle ground. That's really what I was trying to argue. Not open borders, not no enforcement, not endless raids. Middle ground. It's amazing how often that phrase sounds almost radical these days. Politics has become a sport where every issue gets stretched to opposite sidelines. Moderation rarely trends. Compromise rarely goes viral. Nuance certainly doesn't generate millions of clicks. The internet rewards certainty. Television rewards conflict. The middle gets ignored because it doesn't scream loudly enough. That's always frustrated me. So the other thing that bothers us, I told them, about stuff like that, I wasn't talking only about immigration anymore. I was talking about American politics generally, is that nothing ever lands in the middle. Exactly. Everything becomes all or nothing. You're either completely with someone or completely against them. You're either a hero or a monster. You're either saving democracy or destroying civilization. There's almost no room left for people to say, I agree with this part, but I don't agree with that part. That's where I usually find myself. It's not the most comfortable place to stand. Both sides tend to accuse you of secretly belonging to the other, but I still think it's where most Americans actually live. I'm always trying to get people to do that, I said. Don't find the middle. Recognize complexity. Accept that two things can be true at once. A country can need border enforcement, and enforcement can still be criticized when people think it becomes unnecessarily harsh. Those ideas aren't mutually exclusive. JD smiled. Then he surprised everyone. I thought you were crazy liberal. The audience burst into laughter. Perfect timing. I laughed too. You should have watched the show. Another laugh rolled through the studio. Then he answered with something that caught me off guard. I actually do watch the show. Really? That wasn't the answer most people expected, he continued. I laughed my ass off backstage. That earned another big laugh from the audience. Apparently, he'd been watching the opening monologue before coming out. That was a good monologue. Then he added the part that made everyone laugh even harder, even though you were making fun of me. He shrugged. I kind of liked it. Audience. So did I, metaphorically, because that's how politics ought to work. If you can't survive a comedian making jokes about you, you're probably in the wrong profession. I've spent decades making fun of presidents, Republicans, Democrats, celebrities, religious leaders, tech billionaires, my own audience, sometimes even myself. That's literally the job. The fact that JD could come out and say he'd watched the monologue and enjoyed it despite being the target earned genuine appreciation from the crowd. I looked at him. Yeah, it was fair. That's what I try for, not equal jokes, fair jokes. There's a difference. Fair means the joke fits the situation. If you're in power, you're probably going to hear more jokes than the people who aren't. That's been true forever. Then I mentioned something I'd learned over the years. I know someone in your administration watches the show. The audience immediately laughed because they knew exactly where I was going. I always hear about it. Whenever I say something that lands a little too close to home, somehow word gets back, maybe through staff, maybe through friends, maybe through family, maybe somebody records the clip and sends it around. Who knows? Washington has always been a town built on conversations. JD laughed. Then, without hesitation, he confirmed it. You're right. The audience applauded. Finally, he revealed exactly who it was. The second lady, he smiled. She's a big fan. The audience responded with another round of applause and laughter. She's a big fan of Bill Maher. I couldn't help smiling. Politics has a funny way of creating strange little moments like that. 1 minute, you're debating immigration policy with the vice president. The next, you're finding out that someone from the vice president's own household enjoys watching the show where you spend every week making jokes about politicians. Life has a sense of humor. Sometimes it's better than mine. And honestly, that's one of the reasons I still enjoy these conversations, because every now and then, beneath all the headlines, polling numbers, cable news arguments, and social media outrage, you discover something surprisingly ordinary. People watch television. They laugh at jokes. They disagree. They agree. They argue. They keep talking. And for one evening, that's exactly what we did. That little revelation about the second lady watching my show got one more laugh from the audience, and I couldn't help enjoying the irony. Think about it. Every Friday night, I stand on that stage and spend the opening monologue making fun of whoever happens to be running the country, whoever is making headlines, and whoever has handed comedians the best material that week. That's the job. Sometimes Republicans are the target. Usually everybody gets a turn. Then, a few minutes later, I find out someone in the vice president's own family is sitting down to watch. Politics is strange. Television is stranger. And America somehow manages to combine both into one giant weekly reality show. I looked over at JD and laughed. Well, I thought to myself, that's probably the nicest thing anyone in your administration could have said to me. It also reminded me why I still believe these conversations matter. People often assume interviews like this are supposed to end with somebody getting demolished. That's become the expectation. If nobody storms off the stage, if nobody shouts, if nobody delivers the perfect 15-second clip for social media, some viewers decide nothing happened. I couldn't disagree more. Sometimes the most valuable conversations are the ones where neither person changes the other's mind completely, but both leave having actually understood what the other was trying to say. That doesn't make for the loudest headline. It does make for a better country. Throughout our conversation, JD had answered every question directly. I had challenged him where I thought it was appropriate. He had defended his administration's position. Neither of us pretended the disagreements didn't exist, but neither of us treated disagreement as a reason to stop talking. That distinction feels increasingly rare. These days, too many public conversations start with the assumption that the other person must be either dishonest or evil. That's a terrible place to begin. If you assume bad faith from the first sentence, you've already guaranteed the conversation won't go anywhere. What I appreciated about this interview was that we never fell into that trap. When I raised concerns about immigration enforcement, I wasn't accusing everyone involved of malicious intent. I was expressing what I'd heard from many people who felt the government had crossed a line. JD didn't respond by pretending those concerns didn't exist. Instead, he explained why he believed enforcement inevitably creates difficult situations and why his administration viewed that enforcement as necessary. Those are two different perspectives. They don't magically become identical because two people sit in comfortable chairs under bright studio lights. But hearing each side explain itself has value. Far too much of modern politics skips that step entirely. Instead, people argue with versions of their opponents that exist only in their own heads. They debate stereotypes, they attack caricatures, they respond to assumptions rather than actual words. That's easy. Listening is harder. I've always believed comedy can help people listen. Humor lowers defenses. You laugh, your shoulders relax. For a moment, you're not preparing your next argument. You're simply enjoying the moment. Then maybe, just maybe, you become a little more willing to hear something unexpected. That happened several times during our conversation. When JD joked that he thought I was crazy liberal, the audience laughed because they recognized the stereotype. When I fired back that he should actually watch the show, they laughed again because it challenged another stereotype. Then he admitted he did watch the show. Not only that, he'd been laughing backstage. That wasn't the answer anyone expected. And that's exactly why it worked. Real conversations are full of surprises. Scripts usually aren't. One thing I've learned after interviewing politicians from both parties is that television often presents only one version of them. Campaign speeches have a purpose. Press conferences have a purpose. Political advertisements definitely have a purpose. None of those settings encourage people to sound like themselves. A long-form interview can. That doesn't mean politicians stop being politicians. Of course they don't. They're still representing an administration. They're still defending policies. They're still aware that millions of people are watching. But every now and then, you catch a glimpse of the person underneath the carefully prepared talking points. Earlier, I'd told JD that Mike Pence had surprised me by seeming far more human than I'd expected. Some people misunderstand statements like that. They hear them as endorsements. They're not. Recognizing someone's humanity isn't the same thing as agreeing with them. In fact, it's often the first step toward having a meaningful disagreement. If you can't acknowledge the humanity of the person sitting across from you, then you've already stopped having a conversation. You're just performing. I have no interest in performance disguised as discussion. There are already enough places on television where people interrupt each other every 12 seconds while pretending that's productive. I wanted something different. That's why I told JD exactly what people had been saying to me before he came on the show. I didn't soften it. I didn't exaggerate it. I simply repeated it. People told me they believed immigration enforcement had become unnecessarily harsh. That was the concern. He responded with his reasoning. He argued that enforcement without law enforcement isn't enforcement at all. He argued that difficult images don't automatically prove wrongdoing. He argued that the administration had been elected to address immigration and couldn't simply ignore that responsibility. Those were his arguments. I answered by saying I still believed there was a middle ground. That remains my position. The middle isn't always exciting. It doesn't inspire hashtags. It rarely becomes the loudest voice online. But I've spent enough years watching politics to know that most complicated issues aren't solved at the extremes. They're solved somewhere in between. Finding that place isn't easy. Sometimes it isn't even possible. But it's worth looking for. That's why I keep inviting guests who disagree with me. Not because I expect every conversation to end with complete agreement. It won't. And honestly, it shouldn't. If everyone leaves thinking exactly the same thing they thought before, maybe we didn't ask the right questions. If everyone leaves furious, maybe we asked them the wrong way. The goal is somewhere in the middle. There's that phrase again. The middle. People often ask why I continue doing interviews like this. Why invite politicians who know they'll face tough questions? Why have conversations that are guaranteed to upset somebody? Because democracy doesn't benefit from silence. It benefits from discussion, sometimes messy discussion, sometimes uncomfortable discussion, sometimes funny discussion, preferably all three. This interview managed to include each of those elements. We joked about vice presidents. We laughed about Mike Pence possibly appearing on my podcast. We debated immigration enforcement. We talked about political perceptions. We laughed again when JD admitted he'd enjoyed my monologue, despite being the butt of several jokes. Then we ended on a note nobody saw coming. The second lady was a fan of the show. Life has a way of reminding you that people are often more complicated than their public image suggests. That's true for politicians. It's true for comedians. It's true for audiences. People contain contradictions. One person can enjoy sharp political comedy while serving in an administration that frequently becomes the subject of that comedy. A comedian can strongly disagree with a policy while still respecting the person willing to come on stage and defend it. Those things aren't contradictions. They're signs that adults are capable of separating disagreement from hostility. I wish we did more of that. As the conversation wrapped up, I looked around the studio. The audience had laughed, they'd applauded, they'd listened. Most importantly, they'd watched two people with different viewpoints sit across from each other without turning the evening into a shouting match. That shouldn't feel unusual, yet somehow it does. Maybe that's one of the stranger realities of our current moment. Simply having a civil conversation has become newsworthy. I hope it doesn't stay that way forever. I'd much rather live in a country where respectful disagreement is considered normal instead of remarkable. Until then, I'll keep doing what I've always done. I'll keep making jokes. I'll keep asking difficult questions. I'll keep inviting people who think differently than I do. Some viewers will love it. Others will hate it. That's television. More importantly, that's democracy. The audience applauded as the conversation came to a close, and I found myself smiling, not because we'd solved immigration. We hadn't, not because either of us had won some imaginary debate. That wasn't the point. I smiled because for one evening we proved something that's become surprisingly difficult to demonstrate. Two people with real disagreements can still sit down, laugh together, challenge each other honestly, answer difficult questions, and walk away having had a genuine conversation. In today's America, that may not solve every problem, but it's a pretty good place to start.